Welcome to another broadcast of MindYourHealthcast.com. As you probably recall, if you watched the last broadcast, that we were not able to complete it, and so I hope to bring it all together today and finish it up, because I have something very intriguing for the next broadcast, extremely controversial, and yet at the same time, we'll let you decide after you hear the broadcast and read some of the material. Now, one of the most up-to-date books on that is called 21st Century Radionics. Now, right away, I've introduced a term that most people are not familiar with, radionics, and hence the controversy about it, but we will probably need 2 sessions for that one. It's one of my exciting areas. I've always enjoyed it, and I've worked with it, and I know the capabilities of it, but yet at the same time, it's frowned upon in the United States of America, but not so in other parts of the world. At any rate, it's nice to come back with you on the Mind Your Body cast that we started last week. Now, there was more than one meaning in that mind your body. One is really to pay attention to your body. Remember, they used that term many years ago, like mind your P's and Q's, or mind your own business. What it means, of course, is to use your mind to pay attention to your body. Now, why is that so important? Well, because the body is very reactive to what's going on in the mind. In fact, some people have said the body is the hard copy printout of the mind. Whether that's quite true, I'm not sure, but it sounded good, and that's what we're talking about. Now, basically, the reason I'm saying that is because so many of the problems that people have physically, impairments of various sorts, really go back to the unconscious mind, the thinking, the trauma, emotions, a lot of other factors. Now, medicine, of course, has taken a different stance, and I guess we need to get into that at this point. There was a time when spirituality and the body and everything was all considered one thing, but as man began to learn a bit more, there was a group that decided they needed to get the religious side, the spiritual side, out of science, and so they came to an agreement. I mentioned this a long time ago, but many of you probably never heard it. They came to an agreement with the church. The church will deal with spiritual matters, and science will deal with physical matters. And so there started to be this separation, to the point that, interestingly, modern science became a religion. The people in it are just as blinded, in many cases, as the people were in the church, because you remember that the big problem that the church had, and when I say the church, we're basically talking the one in power at the time, which was the Roman Catholic Church. They had taken certain stands. For example, they believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that everything else moved around the Earth. That was called the geocentric concept. And there were some people along the way, as they observed more and more, they realized that that couldn't be true. And so those people became heretics, Galileo Galilei being one of those, who ended up almost losing his life, and in pretty much house arrest the rest of his life, and in the process he had to kind of back off and say, well, maybe the Earth is the center after all. And so anyhow, this big controversy came, and the split came, and so science felt that nothing existed or was significant unless it could be dealt with the 5 senses. In other words, if you can't touch it, see it, taste it, feel it, hear it, it's not valid. And so they set up a box. Now, we mentioned that before about a paradigm, and everything inside that box was true, everything outside the box was true, And the irony of it is, if you're going to be a true scientist, you have to look at all evidence, and those who follow the scientific religion or the religion of science, they don't do that. They already decide that certain things can't be true, and they ignore them. And so they went to the body the same way. They said, well, man is a physical being, and therefore all the problems that man has is physical in their physical nature. So therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the physical body, and we don't want any talk about spirituality. We don't want any talk about the mind or any of those things, because even the mind is really a non-existent entity. What it is nothing more than an artifact from the physical brain. So they got very heavily into it, and it's only been in recent years that the psychoneuroimmunology has become significant, and the placebo and nocebo effect have become prominent, which we've talked about. And so in understanding your mind and body, you really end up having to deal with both of those, because they are all intermixed and you cannot separate them. I guess the only separation that can come is at death, but up to that point, they are interacting. And so many of the physical problems and inabilities and limitations that people have to do with the fact of their mind, especially the subconscious, limiting what they can do with their body. Now, we've mentioned it before. We mentioned the case of Roger Bannister, the miler, many years ago, when science said that it was impossible for man to run a mile in less than 4 minutes, because he would totally collapse and die if he tried to do that. Now, this came out of, quote, medical science, the religion of science, and they said, no, you can't do that. The interesting thing is that there were numerous very good distance runners who tried over and over and over and were unable to break the 4-minute barrier. It became the wall. Interestingly, then on one occasion, Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. He did not collapse and die. And within a couple of weeks or so, several people then had broken the 4-minute mile, who up to that point, no matter how hard they tried, they could not do it. And suddenly it became very doable. And since then, it's never been a problem. Any good runner is going to break the 4-minute mile. So the limitation was placed there by belief systems and the mind. Now, I have studied history tremendously, and when I say tremendously, I mean years and years of probing all the way back as far as there's any information available to know something about the history of mankind. And it seems to me, as societies have come and gone, that a particular society on Earth can tend to go one of two ways. They can either look at nature, they can learn from nature, and they can work with the principles of nature and really have the capability of doing some pretty tremendous things. Or, quote, they can go to technology and they can do things physically and dependent on machines which man builds as extensions of himself. Now, I don't know if you ever thought about that or not, but there is a pretty good book that came out many years ago, and it was called Understanding Media. It was written by Marshall McLuhan, who was a professor at McGill University in Canada. And he did a big study of media and the effects of media on man and man on media. And so he said all the technology that man develops is really an extension of man himself. In other words, we're adding on to our ability to do something by adding technology. And so, for example, he said, having a telephone or a radio extends your hearing and your voice. So that means you can hear from a longer distance and you can speak to a longer distance, even without shouting, by means of technology such as radio, telephone, and so forth. He said that wheels become the extension of our feet. We can move faster and longer with adding that extension to our feet. Tools of various sorts, hammers, saws, power tools, all of those become extensions of our hands. And of course, television becomes an extension of not only our ears and our voice, but also our vision. So, and he classified different types of media as hot and cold media. And so that seems like that's a direction that man can go. Now, however, there were societies that did all kinds of unusual things, but never did it in the same manner. They did not develop all of this high-tech technology like we have, and yet were able to function very successfully in the world and do quite well. And a good book that illustrates the extreme of the technological side is one that I read many years ago, and it was, of course, written very many years ago. And it was written by Aldous Huxley, and it was called Brave New World. Now, what he did is he wrote a fictional story, but at the same time, it was meant to be prophetic of the direction that mankind was going based on what was happening at the time he wrote it. Now, looking at that, he suspected that by the year of 2500 plus, this is where mankind will have gotten to, at least a very likely scenario based on what's been happening. And so he wrote this back in 1931. And it ended up being published in 1932 and became quite a controversial book for a while, but as happens with books, they come and go, and people get excited about them for a while, and then those that tend to be moved by it may be changed in their ideas and view of the world, and those who said, oh, that's ridiculous, that couldn't possibly happen, they put it aside, and that's the end of it. But at any rate, it's a very good book to read because it shows you where mankind can go when they go to the extreme of technology. It ends up that after he wrote the book and observed mankind and society for several years, he ended up at the turn of this century, of the 2000, writing a book called Brave New World Revisited. And there he says that, well, you know, I think I was really optimistic that it could take that long. It appears that we're getting there much faster than what I had originally anticipated. So when you read the book, you will get the idea. It's not a big, long read, but it's very powerful what it has to say. Now, just very rapidly, it has to do with society having progressed to the point that, and in his book, he was thinking this was like 2,500 plus. So we're still talking almost 500 years from now, or around 500 years. But he realized, as I said in his review of it, that, wow, this is coming much, much faster. And so the gist of it is that society had progressed to the point that the people in power or control decided that man could not be trusted in certain areas, and that certain emotional areas became detrimental to peace and, I wouldn't say contentment, but functionality of a society. And so it became illegal to have marriage, it became illegal to have children, it became illegal to have spirituality as most people had thought about it, and so forth. So that right away was wiped out. In fact, what they did not want was any kind of relationship that involved the emotions. So they came up with a new plan. The plan was, okay, we're going to control society in number as well as function. So what we're going to do is there'll be no children born by the natural birth process. That's out. In fact, it's a crime if anybody were to have a child. So basically what they do, they remove the ovum from women, and they had these facilities which they referred to as hatcheries and conditioning centers. So what they would do is it became the equivalent of what they now refer to as a test tube baby. In other words, they fertilized the egg, they grew it in vitro, which means in glass or dish, and they, during that process, they managed and conditioned the growing fetus so that it was going to take its place in society as the powers that be chose that they take. In other words, you had nothing to say about it. So they had a panel, and it reminds me now we're talking about panels having to do with the new healthcare program. They had a panel who decided that there's going to be different levels of society, and we're going to predetermine, okay, this fetus is going to be a doctor, this fetus is going to be a plumber, this fetus is going to be a factory worker, and so forth. And so, depending on how they conditioned the fetus as it developed, would determine the caste position that they would hold. So they had the alpha, what we every day call alpha, I call alpha from the Greek. They had the alpha group, and that was the highest level from the Greek letter alpha, which means like our equivalent of A. And then they had these people who were the pluses. They were plus intellectuals, and they were right at the top of the heap. So then we have the alpha, the beta, the gamma, the delta, and the epsilon. Epsilon was the absolute bottom of the barrel. Those were the everyday laborers and workers. So you had no choice in the matter. Whatever they decided this fetus is going to be, that's what it was programmed and conditioned to be. And it got to be quite interesting because, as in my mind always happens, there's always a malcontent somewhere that can cause trouble. But they didn't want trouble, so they worked very hard to keep that from happening. And they actually gave everybody a psychotropic drug called soma that caused you to feel very relaxed and euphoric, and therefore you didn't have a lot of thought about what your plight was. So that if you ended up being programmed to be a worker, you needed to be content with being a worker and need have no ambitions of moving up the ladder because you couldn't. You were programmed to be epsilon, and epsilon you would be, and that's it. So, to keep you, as I say, from being too malcontent, you take soma, this drug, which soma is the Greek for body, this drug that relaxed your body but gave you a rather elevated state of mind. Sounds like some things that we have today. And of course, quote, test tube babies or in vitro fertilization and so forth, that's already occurred. But imagine a society where that's the only way it could be done. And so they wanted to get rid of any emotions. In fact, they realized that man has the capability. So once a month they had to go through a special program where their body was flooded with adrenaline, and they got angry and all of those emotions that it normally was not legal to be expressed. They went through all that so that they could discharge built-up tensions and keep them under control. Now, that was the society that Huxley saw coming based on the direction we were going and how we were looking at technology. So you think about it, you read the book, and you see if that's the direction you want to go when you follow the religion of science to its extreme. Now, I'm not against science. I consider myself to be a scientist, and I understand scientific method, but I understand true scientific medicine, not or anything scientific, when you actually look at all the data, and you have no preconceived ideas about what it can be. In other words, if you decide that certain things cannot be, then of course you won't look for those, and whatever you do find is going to be, in many cases, distorted because you have left out certain information. So I think it's a good book to read to kind of get you thinking, but it's up to you. I'm just, again, the provocateur. I want to give you information, and you have to pick it up, and you'll have to go look at it yourself. These are my opinions based on my many years of digging. In fact, I would say 50-some years, heavy years of digging and learning and researching has brought me to where I am today. Okay, so I'm giving you all that to say that I'm convinced that our mind does have a huge effect on our body, and there's a lot of other researchers that do that. Now, I have talked about the fact that there's different early parts of our life that can create some big problems that many times you don't become aware till way down the road after it's been reinforced enough. There was pre and perinatal we mentioned about, which are extremely important, and then that first 3 years of life. Extremely important. And then, of course, the nutrition that we need for everything to develop properly, especially the fatty acids and the minerals have a tremendous amount of impact on the way the brain works and the body. And to be healthy and function well, those all have to be looked at. But there's some very good researchers that have gotten heavily into this whole idea of these early influences and what they do to you. So one of the good ones that you should start to read and understand is a doctor psychiatrist by the name of Clancy McKenzie. He has written some books, especially on motherhood, which of course was not a part of the Brave New World, and how it has effect on a child. And he's very emphatic about the first 3 years of life. And I did a lot of work in psychology, psychotherapy, had a lot of background training in it years ago, and have utilized it, even though I don't always call it that. When I work with people, I'm looking at a broader picture, not just what's your body's symptoms, but what may be going on with that. And so McKenzie found that it's during that first 3 years, traumatic events happen that the child may, after they happen, bury them inside and not get rid of it. And down the road, other events add to it until finally one day they have a big break. So he's saying pretty much all the serious psychological things that happen down the road in your life started in that first 3 years. And he did tremendous studies with thousands and thousands of people to verify that. And he got to the point that if you hit that last straw and you have a break, regardless whether quote, what they used to call nervous breakdown, whether it's psychotic, whether it's schizophrenic, manic depressive, where you really get to the point that you're unable to function well. He said that what happens, you activate the portion of the brain that was active at the time the original trauma occurred in early childhood, and therefore your behavior becomes of that period of time. So he was able, if he knew what the behavior was, he could say, well, this happened when the child was 2 years and 6 months old. That's when this event occurred. Then he started looking, well, what happened in this child's life back then? Well, the mother had another baby. Well, why would that be such a traumatic event? Well, the child right away sees that the mother's attention is pulled away, and to the child, not logically, but emotionally, they feel threatened because historically we came in with this protective mechanism that says we have to be taken care of by our mother in this early part of life. If we get separated, we could die because we're not able to take care of ourselves. And so that is the process that happens, and therefore the child gets stuck. So he said pretty much all those problems are delayed post-traumatic stress problem. In other words, it happened way back then, but it didn't become a major issue till way down the road. So his material is good to get into, and it gets you looking at the body and behavior and some of those early events. Now, as I said earlier, I used to do a tremendous amount of psychotherapy per se, and I used a system called transactional analysis, which was developed by a psychiatrist by the name of Eric Byrne. But it's a good way of understanding, and there's books out there on transactional analysis, which is the analysis of transactions, how people communicate and interact with each other. But the important part of it that I liked was something called the injunction, which at the first 3 years of life, you are still attached to your mother emotionally, psychologically, and at around age 3 is when the emotional, psychological birth occurs. And how that occurs makes a tremendous impact. Now, that goes very much along with what later I had found out that Dr. McKenzie had found. So that it was called in transactional analysis the injunction. It means it's not okay for you to be you, you have to become somebody else. So what you do, you write yourself a life script, pick your own costumes, your own characters, your own profession or situation, and you start to live out a play that you write for yourself, but it's not you. And so of course you're not happy, and there's a lot more implications to it, something called the script release, which can be very traumatic. It's the only way you can get a release. And we don't really have time to get into that, but I'm introducing it to you because you might want to go back and read about transactional analysis. There were some aspects of it that became very trendy, such as the games that people play. And the games were types of transactions that avoid intimacy and end up in the payoff to reinforce your injunction and your script so that you go away feeling bad and get nowhere in your life. And so we did a lot of work with that and had some very good results in helping people get rid of a lot of problems and begin to function. Now see, I'm telling you that to say there's different conceptual ideas that are very similar, and so you can find that somebody could be helped with McKenzie's work, they could be helped with transactional analysis, they may be helped with Gestalt therapy work. There's a lot of approaches to it, but the understanding is this mind-body relationship, and how many times what we think is a big health problem is really a background emotional traumatic problem that's expressing itself through our body. Now, there's another big guy who came along. He wasn't big in size, or he might have been, because I never saw him face to face. Dr. Wilhelm Reich, R-E-I-C-H, and he developed something called orgone therapy. And he was a friend, kind of, a controversial friend of Freud. I would say there was some combativeness that went on. But anyhow, he understood the relationship of the body to the mind. Freud did to a degree, but I don't think he played it up as much. In fact, he was not a clinician. He was a researcher, but he developed something called psychoanalysis, and he kind of had the feeling if you can bring it out and talk about it and understand what happened, that will solve the problem. But of course that didn't work that way. And so Reich was the one who really laid out this foundation, and he called it body armoring, and he said the body physically becomes part of your defense mechanism. And there are bands of armor that go around the body, and it causes certain muscle groups to lock up. And until you can physically break those tensions, just talking about the problem will never solve it. And so he was a very good one to get into, and I've mentioned before about him. He did a lot of things because he eventually got into what's called biophysics, and he did some very controversial work that got him in trouble because ultimately, as I mentioned before, he was getting rid of cancer, and that was a no-no, so he ended up getting shot down, even though he was an MD and a psychiatrist. That was a no-no. You were infringing into an industry that was making too much money, and his treatment was so simple and so inexpensive that could not go over. And plus, he upset a lot of other apple carts in some of his research and showed that a lot of things that are taught in biophysics or biochemistry and so forth and biology weren't quite accurate. And so other people have since then verified his work, so I became very convinced and very happy about it. And so he and Freud, the two of them, had problems back and forth. Now, other doctors and or therapists that have come along was Dr. Fritz Perls, P-E-R-L-S, and he developed something called Gestalt therapy. And Gestalt is a German term that means configuration. It means stressors that are going on in your system, whether conscious or unconscious, come to the surface to get your attention. And then when they're trying to get your attention, everything else is off in the background. So it's this configuration of foreground to background and stressors. And so he realized that these stressors were trying to manifest themselves or be resolved, basically. And so he used that as a basis of therapy, but he also studied heavily Reich's work about the body involvement. So he was very much tuned in to the idea that you have an emotional trauma, to store it away, and first of all, that generates a lot of energy. Then you store it away because you don't want to face it or deal with it, or it happened at a time that it was automatically stored away and you don't even know it, or at least you didn't pay attention that it happened, and so you've kind of forgotten about it. And so, nonetheless, it's taking a tremendous amount of energy to hold it in the background, and it's trying to push to the foreground all the time to get your attention to resolve it. And so that creates conflict. It uses up a lot of energy stores, which affects body function. And as Reich said, certain areas of the body, the muscles tighten up, restrict energy flow to that area, and then health problems develop. So being aware of those things like ulcers, we always tie those together with stress and the way we deal or don't deal with stress. So we know that it can be a big problem. And of course, Candace Pert, we've mentioned before, and so what I'm trying to do is bring this all together to make you more aware of yourself and what's going on and your family and the people you deal with. Candace Pert, got into something called neuropeptides, and I've mentioned her before and her work. And these neuropeptides store through the whole body, carry information and store. So basically, goes along with what Reich said. We store our memory in all the cells of our body. And so if you've got a bad memory with a lot of bad energy, guess what's going to happen to the cells that it's stored in? And I don't know. I've kind of observed it, but I know for a fact that anger is a big emotion related to the liver. Now, this comes out of Chinese medicine. They realize that each organ has an emotional counterpart. My feeling is that likely emotions that involve tremendous amounts of anger and irritability may get stored in the liver because of the fact that that is the significant emotion of liver, and therefore cause you a lot of liver problems and a lot of worry and obsessive thinking that some people might develop will store in the spleen and cause big problems with the spleen. Originally functional problems, and later, if it continues, pathological. And so the work of Candace Pert is very good to look into, to understand how this can all tie together. Now, Dr. Rilke Hammer, H-A-M-E-R, in Germany, found this big relationship, especially with cancer, but with others, that you have an unresolved emotional trauma. It actually changes a portion of the brain somewhere, the structure, which is visible on a CT scan, which then affects a certain part of the body, depending on what part of the body is related to that part of the brain structure, because there is these big interrelations. And therefore, if you can find that unresolved conflict and resolve it, the brain influence or disturbance improves. I mean, you can actually take another CT scan and see that it's changed, it's improving, and the tumor begins to shrink up and disappear. And of course, as you can imagine, again, he was an MD oncologist in Germany. He's now, the last I heard, in exile in Iceland or someplace because they tried to wipe him out once he got going heavily, because he was an oncologist and he was treating cancer, and after 20 years of heavy research realized didn't need the chemotherapy, didn't need the surgery, the radiation. You can resolve the problem and the people can get well. So he was wiped out of the picture. Now, there is another doctor who has come along who was a PhD psychologist, and he had a lot of other heavy background, called Dr. Peter Levine, he wrote a book which is a good one to read called Waking the Tiger. And it tells about how he discovered about the effects of suppressed trauma and developed methods to release it and bring it out. And in the book, he actually gives you an understanding of it and some exercises you can do to sometimes do some of your own self-therapy. He's also put out some recordings on taking you through the process that you can get from Nightingale Conan. They have a whole set of his recordings you can get. And so he recognized this body relationship and how and it has to do with certain biological capabilities that we have to deal with trauma, and what happens if that's not allowed to follow through. And he observed it in animals and how they, if they were chased, attacked, or in a panic position, how they responded and how they cleared out the trauma so that it did not continue on with them. They did it naturally, and of course we're too educated and too civilized to do that, and so that's what he does. He actually takes you back through the process and clears out this stored up energy that's causing a lot of problems. So he's a very good one to get into. And just to take it one step further, or we're out of time, I see, there's two doctors from Switzerland by the name of Bonus and Bonus. They were husband and wife, and over the years they observed that there was always this emotional background in all these health problems that people came to them with. And so finally they decided, well, we're just going to deal with everything that people come to us with from the emotional side. And so they developed a series of homeopathic combinations that in essence cover about 28 different emotional issues that people tend to have, and the interconnection between them and a series of nerve plexus that are in the body. And so what they did is they finally said, okay, no matter what people come to us with, we're going to start treat them with the emotional side. And so they found that their results were better doing this than doing what they were doing before. So that became their system, and it's called psychosomatic energetics. Again, soma, getting back to the soma thing, which is body. So it's the psychological body energetics. And of course, I've studied all this for years, and there are a lot of other writers that have been involved with all this. But I wanted to introduce you to some that might make you start looking. And some of these, as I say, Levine's material, there's a lot of stuff you can do on your own. Transaxle analysis, there's a lot of things you can do with that. The Reichian therapy, which eventually became known as bioenergetics, and there's some material out there by Dr. Alexander Lowen, who studied with Reich, and Stanley Kellerman, who's a PhD psychologist. They have some books out that get into detail about the armoring idea and ways that you can break this loose and get the energy flowing. And what happens is, of course, then the body improves too. So you not only improve your emotional capabilities and coping mechanisms, but you also free up a lot of physiological problems that finally medicine has agreed to a degree that there's some type of emotional counterpart, but they still basically try to deal with it with medications and drugs anyhow. So I hope I've given you enough to kind of wake you up and get you thinking, and some things to look at that could be extremely helpful for you. And don't forget, the next broadcast, we're going to be doing the one on radionics, which is one of my favorites. Most people have not heard of the term, have no idea what it's about. Hearing onyx on it, maybe they think of electronics. But apart from that, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it's probably going to be a two-part broadcast also, but I think you'll find it extremely interesting, and some of the things that have been done with it seem incredible, but very powerful and, in my mind, very significant. But as I said, in this country, it's looked on very unfavorably, and in fact, it's out of radionics. It came the term, well, that's a black box, it doesn't really do anything. And it became a negative term, but there are other parts of the world where it was proven in court with scientists that it was valid and it worked. And in fact, in this country, as you'll find out, actually a patent was issued at one point for a radionics type device. So it was nice to be with you again. Don't forget to go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and look through our pages. We keep adding information and books and other pertinent pieces of material or whatever that I feel might be useful for you to have better health. And you can also, from the link there, go to to Alternative Health and Prevention website and find out more what we do as far as the office side for people who want to know a little bit more about what I do. It's nice being with you again, and we'll look forward to you being with us with the next broadcast. In the meantime, be healthy.